The Greatest Love Story, Jarmo Palamaki. Chapter 1. Fitzwilliam Darcy folded the letter from Charles Bingley, a faint frown creasing his brow. His friend, recently settled at Netherfield Park, was, predictably, overwhelmed by the minutiae of estate administration. Bingley, bless his open heart, was a man of excellent temperament for society, but utterly lost in a sea of ledgers, tenant grievances, and farming schedules. Darcy had, of course, agreed to assist. The frown, however, was not for Bingley's administrative ineptitude. It was for the inevitable entourage. Wherever Darcy, the master of Pemberley and possessed of 10,000 a year, made an appearance, a certain species of woman seemed to materialize from the very air of predatory creatures, with calculating eyes, eager smiles, and an unshakable belief that a wealthy husband was their birthright. He abhorred the attention, the fawning, the thinly veiled attempts to secure his fortune rather than his character. He would be at Netherfield for work, not for a matrimonial parade. An idea, bold and slightly mischievous, began to form. Darcy spent the next hour in his dressing room, not selecting his finest silks or most elaborate waistcoats, but rather choosing with meticulous care. He bypassed the superfine broadcloth and gold-button coats, opting instead for a sturdy, well-made, but undeniably plain dark blue coat. His breeches were of durable, unfashionable kerseymere, his boots polished but practical, not the gleaming, ornate Hessians one might expect. His linen, though impeccably clean, lacked any elaborate embroidery or lace. He combed his dark hair into a severe, unfussy style. He even forgave himself the omission of his customary signet ring, leaving his hands bare. The reflection in the mirror showed a man of good standing, certainly, but one who might be taken for a prosperous land agent, a well-paid steward, or perhaps a gentleman of modest but secure income. There was no outward display of the vast wealth that proclaimed him one of England's most eligible bachelors. He cultivated a slightly more reserved, almost businesslike air. He would be Mr. Darcy, certainly, but without the emphasis on "of Pemberley" that usually preceded it. When he arrived at Netherfield, Bingley, effusive as ever, practically ran to greet him. "Darcy, my dear fellow, you've arrived." "Oh, thank heaven, I was about to sign away half the park to a man who claimed to have lost a prize hog 2 decades ago." Bingley clapped him heartily on the shoulder, then paused, a puzzled expression crossing his face. "You look different, old friend. Rather understated." Darcy allowed himself a small, dry smile. "I am here to work, Bingley. One hardly requires sartorial splendor to untangle your ledgers." Caroline Bingley, elegant and predatory even in her own home, swept into the hall, followed by the more placid Louisa Hurst. Caroline's eyes, usually quick to appraise, lingered on Darcy with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. "Mr. Darcy," she said, her voice a little cooler than usual, "how plain you look today. One might almost mistake you for one of Bingley's assistants." The last word was uttered with a sniff of disdain. Louisa merely gave a languid nod, seemingly relieved that Darcy was not vying for attention. Darcy bowed, a faint flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Indeed, Miss Bingley, I am here to assist your brother in every capacity required. Bingley," he continued, his voice firm, "I must impress upon you a singular condition for my presence here." Bingley, ever cheerful, turned from admiring the view. "My dear fellow, anything! Just name it." Darcy met his friend's gaze with unyielding gravity. "It is this. During my stay, no mention whatsoever of my fortune, my income, or my possessions is to be made to anyone. Not to new acquaintances, not to the servants. It is a complete embargo. Should this condition be broken by anyone, I shall immediately depart. No questions, no excuses. I will simply leave." Bingley blinked, momentarily taken aback. "But why, Darcy? You know everyone will be curious." "Precisely," Darcy replied, a hint of weariness in his tone. "I have grown weary of being seen solely as an appendage to Pemberley's income. For once, I wish to observe and be observed without the distorting lens of wealth. Can you agree to this?" Bingley, though perplexed, valued Darcy's friendship above all else. "Of course, old friend. I shall warn Caroline and Louisa immediately. Though, he added with a slight grimace, they may find it challenging. And so it began. The Bingley sisters, upon hearing the extraordinary decree, exchanged incredulous glances. Caroline Bingley, usually so adept at subtle social maneuvers involving elevated status, felt her most potent weapon disarmed. It is quite absurd, Charles. How are we to impress anyone if we cannot speak of Mr. Darcy's consequence? She exclaimed, but Bingley remained firm. The neighborhood of Meryton, as expected, was agog with the arrival of the wealthy Mr. Bingley and his even wealthier friend, Mr. Darcy. But the wealth remained an unspoken, tantalizing mystery. At the assembly, at dinner parties, at social calls, the air around Mr. Darcy hummed with unspoken questions. Mrs. Bennet, a woman for whom a good income was the paramount virtue, found herself utterly bewildered. He is handsome, to be sure, she whispered to Jane, but what is his fortune? Nobody will say a word. Darcy, for his part, found the experiment both frustrating and enlightening. He observed the subtle attempts to pry, the leading questions about London's society or the upkeep of large estates. He gave polite but deliberately vague answers, always careful to avoid anything that touched upon his prescribed topic. He saw Caroline Bingley's thinly veiled frustration whenever she attempted to praise his taste without being able to quantify its cost. He saw Mrs. Hurst's resigned amusement. But Darcy immersed himself in Netherfield's affairs. He meticulously reviewed leases, straightened accounts, interviewed tenants with quiet authority, and even rode out to inspect fences and drainage ditches, often returning with mud on his sturdy boots and traces of dust on his plain coat. He was efficient, focused, and utterly devoid of the haughty, remote air that often characterized his social presence. He offered precise advice, spoke plainly, and ate meals with an almost deferential quietness. The transformation was remarkably effective. Caroline, convinced he was having a temporary fit of peculiar economy, or perhaps even some unexpected financial difficulty, restricted her flirtations and started to rethink her desire to be the mistress of Pemberley. Local ladies, having heard of Mr. Darcy but not quite grasping the extent of his fortune in his muted presentation, found him polite but somewhat unexciting, too absorbed in his friend's affairs to be properly charming. He was no longer the glittering prize, but a competent, respectable gentleman of quiet demeanor. Chapter 2. The Meryton assembly was, as ever, a chaotic blend of excessive color, loud good humor, and the persistent, low hum of provincial gossip. Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, who generally found such company intolerable, found himself in a peculiar state of disquietude. The rumors had begun to spread weeks ago, helped along by the malicious tongue of a certain acquaintance. In response, Darcy had chosen a particularly quiet suit of clothes for the evening. Fine wool, certainly, but devoid of the diamond pins and elaborate waistcoats he customarily wore. They were, as everyone was whispering, merely decent. Clothes befitting a man who had perhaps lost a considerable portion of his inheritance. It was Sir William Lucas, beaming with self-importance, who led Darcy through the throng and introduced him formally to the Bennet family. Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Bennet, allow me to present Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy of Derbyshire, a most distinguished gentleman, though uncommonly modest in his present attire, as you may note. Darcy endured Mrs. Bennet's effusive greeting and the sharp, assessing silence of Mr. Bennet, but his politeness was instantly abandoned the moment his eyes fell upon the second Miss Bennet, Miss Elizabeth. Bennet was not the most beautiful woman in the room. That distinction belonged to her elder sister Jane, but she possessed a vivacity, a sharpness that seemed to catch the candlelight and reflect it back with dangerous brilliance. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, were assessing him with an alarming mixture of curiosity and disdain. Normally, Darcy's pride would have demanded he remain aloof, observe from a distance and judge the company according to their merits, which were generally few. But the moment he met Elizabeth's gaze, the careful barricade of his reserve crumbled. He felt an urge, sudden and forceful, to know her better, to see if her wit could match her countenance. He bowed stiffly to Mrs. Bennet, then turned immediately to Elizabeth. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice deeper and more urgent than he intended. May I have the honor of soliciting your hand for the next dance?" He expected the immediate, delighted acceptance that was usually his due, even in reduced circumstances. Instead, Elizabeth merely fixed him with a look of perfect, serene amusement. "You are very kind, sir," she replied, her tone cool and measured, "but I must disappoint you. My dance card is quite full for the remainder of the evening." Darcy's brow furrowed slightly. He glanced around the room. The assembly was still forming, and he knew a woman of her standing, though popular, would reserve at least one set. "Indeed," he pressed, refusing to retreat. "Perhaps for a later set, before the supper is called?" Elizabeth's expression hardened, the amusement melting into a pointed censure. She leaned in just slightly, ensuring their conversation remained private, and her voice dropped to a level that was devastatingly precise. "No, Mr. Darcy, and since we are being frank, I shall tell you I would not have accepted you, even had my card possessed 7 blank spaces." Darcy inhaled sharply, utterly blindsided. No woman had ever refused him with such deliberate cruelty. "May I inquire as to the cause of such decided aversion, Miss Bennet?" Elizabeth's dark eyes flashed with a moral certainty that astonished him. "I have recently had the pleasure of conversing with Mr. Wickham, sir," she stated, her voice edged with protective indignation. "And I find his account of your history deeply troubling. It is one thing to be proud, Mr. Darcy, but quite another to deceive and defraud a gentleman who was once entitled to your patronage." She paused, allowing the accusation to settle like soot upon his character. Darcy, rigid with shock and rage at the mention of Wickham's name, could only stare. Elizabeth, however, was not finished. She lowered her voice still further, infusing it with a theatrical, if slightly patronizing pity. "But there is a further, more immediate reason. Mr. Wickham has confided that through unfortunate investments and careless management, you have suffered a terrible reversal of fortune, that Pemberley's famed rents are now significantly diminished, and that, in fact, you have lost the greater part of your possessions." She gave a small, sympathetic sigh, the pity in her expression pure mockery. "And while I am perfectly willing to dance with a man of merely decent clothes, I confess, Mr. Darcy, I have a deep aversion to dancing with a man who is actively ruinous." The blow was twofold: a violent attack on his moral integrity, followed by a triumphant broadcast of the very rumor his simple attire had been meant to subtly quell. Darcy felt a coldness spread through him that had nothing to do with the draughty hall. Wickham had not merely spread tales of personal grievance, he had attacked the very foundation of Darcy's social standing, his wealth. He found himself utterly speechless. The overwhelming desire he had felt seconds before to court this woman transformed into a searing, agonizing rage that was directed both at Wickham and at Elizabeth for so readily believing the worst of him. He managed a single, clipped word: "Indeed." He executed a bow that was less deference and more a mechanical acknowledgement of imminent war. His eyes, fixed on hers, promised a reckoning she did not yet understand. "Then I shall not detain you further, Miss Bennet. My apologies for presuming upon your empty time." Without another word, Darcy turned and retreated, leaving Elizabeth standing amidst the milling crowd. Elizabeth watched him go, a triumphant but slightly unsettling feeling in her breast. She saw him vanish toward the card-room, his posture stiff with wounded pride. She had judged him, condemned him, and watched him suffer the consequence, all in less than 5 minutes. "Well, Lizzie," observed Jane, who had been chatting nearby, "you appear to have quite demolished that poor gentleman. He looks as though he has swallowed the entire assembly." Elizabeth folded her hands primly. "He deserved the correction, Jane. To first cheat a friend, and then carry himself with such arrogance despite his evident poverty, is an insupportable combination. One must teach him to behave with more humility, or not at all." Yet, as she considered the genuine, profound shock in Darcy's eyes as she spoke of his lost fortune, a flicker of doubt troubled her composure. He had looked not merely annoyed, but utterly devastated. "No," she told herself firmly, "it is merely the pride of a ruined man. Mr. Wickham is a man of honor and suffered greatly, And Mr. Darcy is now, quite rightly, suffering too. She dismissed the unpleasant tightness in her chest and turned her attention to the next gentleman that had reserved her hand, a gentleman of known, steady income. Chapter 3. The previous night had been sleepless, filled with the devastating echoes of Miss Elizabeth Bennet's contempt. Darcy knew he could not remain caged within the house. He needed distance, motion, and the sharp clarity of the late autumn morning to reorganize the scattered pieces of his pride. He mounted his powerful black gelding, Nero, choosing a route that led toward the village of Meryton. He was still using his decent clothes. They were the attire of a gentleman, though certainly less immaculate than the silks he usually had worn. The rhythmic pounding of Nero's hoofs was a balm, absorbing the frantic energy of his troubled mind. Darcy was deeply engrossed in re-examining the words Elizabeth had laid at his door when the road ahead bent, bringing the village properties into view. And there they were. Elizabeth Bennet, her cheeks flushed with exercise and mirth, hand in hand with Mr. George Wickham. They were walking slowly, intimately close, sharing a jest that made her throw back her head in delighted, careless laughter. The sight was a violent shock to Darcy's system, a sudden, brutal confirmation of her complete disregard for his judgment. Darcy slowed his horse, intending to pass them quickly, maintaining the cold, distant civility that had become his only shield. But Elizabeth saw him. Her laughter died, replaced instantly by an expression of sharp, calculated amusement. She squeezed Wickham's hand and leaned in, close enough for the gesture to appear affectionate, yet loud enough for her comment to carry clearly on the still air. "Look, George," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "See what the road has brought us. There comes the beggar." Wickham, startled, turned his head, a smooth blend of surprise and calculated concern replacing his merriment. The insult struck Darcy with the force of a physical blow. He pulled Nero to a halt, the horse tossing his head slightly as foam gathered at the bit. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them. Darcy felt the hot rush of humiliation, but a more urgent emotion, protective desperation, won out. He could tolerate her cruelty, but he could not tolerate her rushing toward destruction. "Miss Bennet," Darcy stated, his voice tight and low, ignoring Wickham entirely, "I urge you to consider the company you keep." Elizabeth raised her eyebrows, feigning innocent surprise. "And why should I, sir? We were enjoying a perfectly pleasant walk until you decided to intrude upon the King's highway." "Mr. Wickham," Darcy pressed, leaning slightly from the saddle, his gaze fixed solely on her earnest, foolish face. "I have attempted to warn you before, but your prejudice is deep. I shall say it plainly. George Wickham is not the good man you believe him to be. He is a liar, a man of staggering debts, and a thorough cheater of those who trust him." Wickham let go of Elizabeth's hand, stepping forward with a practiced air of injured innocence. "Indeed, Mr. Darcy? A public accusation? I hope, ma'am, that you will not let the slanders of a ruined man spoil our morning." Elizabeth immediately slipped her hand back into Wickham's arm, her eyes sparkling with defiant loyalty. "Why should I believe you, sir?" she challenged, her tone scathing. "You accuse an amiable, honorable gentleman of the basest villainy, yet offer no proof beyond your own superior assertion. I have seen the way you hold yourself, the pride, the arrogance. I know your character." She paused, taking in his slightly dust-flecked coat and the necessary simplicity of his riding attire. She finished the thought that had begun with the initial insult, sealing her rejection with callous finality. "I believe the amiable Mr. Wickham entirely," she declared, giving Wickham a reassuring smile. "And I certainly do not believe Mr. Darcy in his rags." A deep silence fell. The casual cruelty of the dual insult, reducing his character and his appearance to the level of a vagrant, was absolute. She had not only dismissed his warning, but had used his very presence as justification for her continued friendship with his antagonist. Darcy stared at her, the hope he had carried for a possible reconciliation, or at least a civil understanding, dissolving completely. Her prejudice was not simply a mistake, it was a fortress built on willful blindness, reinforced by her pride in her own quick judgment. He inhaled sharply, his jaw rigid. There was nothing more to be said. He would not lower himself to argue the quality of his tailor or the size of his estate in the face of such calculated malice. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of deep rejection, not of her, but of her error. "As you wish, Miss Bennet," he said, the words flat and cold. Without waiting for a reply, Darcy gathered the reins and turned Nero sharply on the road. He put the horse into a swift canter, leaving the sound of their combined renewed laughter ringing behind him. A laughter that pursued him like the sharp sting of the whip, long after Meryton was out of sight. He had thought the rejection at the ball was the greatest injury to his pride, yet this sudden public contempt was a deeper, more agonizing wound. Elizabeth Bennet did not simply dislike him, she actively despised him and welcomed the company of a villain to prove the point. Chapter 4. The next days were a blur of purposeful avoidance for Fitzwilliam Darcy. The grand rooms of Netherfield seemed to echo with the hollow ring of his own foolishness. He found excuses to be in the library poring over estate ledgers with a concentration he didn't truly possess, or to ride out for hours across the frosty fields, the biting wind a welcome distraction from the inferno within his chest. The pain was a physical ache, a constant companion. He had met with such vehemence, such disdain, such ridicule, it was a blow to his pride that stung worse than any insult. He had been castigated, his intentions twisted, his character assassinated, all by the woman who had captivated him like no other. The sting of Elizabeth's words, her fierce rejection, her accusations, replayed in his mind like a broken record. Each syllable was a fresh wound, a reminder of the chasm that had opened between them. Yet, beneath the searing shame and the bruised ego, an unshakable truth lingered. Even in his deepest hurt, Darcy could not wholly condemn her. He knew Elizabeth was like a rough, uncut, diamond-spirited, intelligent, quick-witted, with a fire that he had come to admire above all else. But that very fire, that fierce independence, had been tragically misdirected. She was, he realized with a heavy heart, totally deceived by the lies of George Wickham. The thought of Wickham sent a shiver of dread down his spine, a cold counterpoint to the heat of his own wounded pride. How could she not see it? How could such a discerning mind be so completely ensnared by such a transparent villain? He remembered the calculated charm, the feigned innocence, the subtle poison Wickham had woven around his past. Elizabeth, with her keen sense of justice and her quick judgments, had fallen prey to it entirely. It twisted his gut to think of her believing such calumnies, her bright eyes clouded by untruths. In the quiet solitude of his study, or beneath the vast, indifferent sky, Darcy found himself doing something he hadn't done with such desperate earnestness since his mother's passing. He prayed. He prayed for guidance for himself, for the strength to bear this crushing disappointment with dignity, and for wisdom to know if there was any path forward. But mostly, with a depth of feeling that surprised even him, he prayed for Elizabeth. He prayed that she would be spared the worst that could inevitably happen with Wickham. He knew Wickham's true nature, his insidious capacity for destruction, and the thought of Elizabeth, that vibrant, precious, albeit infuriating woman, falling victim to it was a torment he could scarcely bear. He had tried to warn her. He had laid out the truth, as stark and unvarnished as he could. But she had been too blind, too angry, too enthralled by the illusion. Now all he could do was watch, wait, and pray that clarity would come to her before the rough diamond was irrevocably tarnished. And in his heart he knew, with a certainty that transcended his own immediate pain, that he would do whatever truly lay within his power to prevent it, even if she continued to despise him for it. Chapter 5. The morning at Netherfield Park had begun with the usual measured elegance. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley were discussing the deplorable quality of the local embroidery. Mr. Darcy, already weary of their conversation, was entrenched behind the Times, seeking refuge in foreign politics. The civilized calm, however, was shattered by a sound wholly unsuitable for a gentleman's dwelling: the frantic clatter of boots and a desperate, half-sobbing exclamation. Charles Bingley burst into the breakfast room, his usually cheerful face a mask of scarlet anxiety. He was disheveled, and the breath hitched violently in his chest. "Caroline, Louisa, Darcy, have you heard the news?" He gripped the back of a gilded chair as if fearing he might otherwise fall. "It is the most ghastly, the most unbelievable thing. Ruination. Absolute ruination." Mrs. Hurst dropped her sugar tongs. Caroline Bingley immediately straightened, her expression hardening from annoyance to predatory interest. Darcy lowered his newspaper, his gray eyes fixed on his friend, the sudden intensity of Bingley's distress cutting through his habitual reserve. "Bingley, compose yourself," Darcy commanded, his voice leveled despite the rising tension. "What on earth has occurred? A fire? A bankruptcy? Worse, Darcy, infinitely worse than mere money. It is Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Oh my God, it is Miss Elizabeth." Bingley wrung his hands, pacing the length of the rug. Caroline Bingley tapped her spoon impatiently against her saucer. "Pray, Charles, spare us the histrionics. What folly has Miss Elizabeth committed now? No doubt she has been caught walking without proper shoes or speaking without permission. No, Caroline, silence. This is serious. This is fatal." Bingley finally managed to stand still long enough to deliver the blow, his voice dropping to a choked whisper. "It is Wickham. The regiment is already abuzz. Meryton is speaking of nothing else. It is said he attempted to take her virtue. He pressed her for a considerable time, promising marriage. But when she refused him and held fast to her honor—" Bingley shuddered, unable to speak the exact vulgar details of the rumor's origin. "When she refused him," he continued, taking a shuddering breath, "Wickham, driven by the devil himself, seized her, openly in the public street by the inn, and took a kiss by force. A collective, sharp inhalation filled the room. Mrs. Hurst's hands flew to her mouth. He then immediately fled the scene, only to send a curt message this very morning. He refuses the match. He denies any obligation and states that Miss Elizabeth's dowry is not enough to get married, and that everything had been her fault." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, broken only by the shivering rattle of Bingley's breath. Caroline Bingley was the first to recover, and when she did, her reaction was not pity, but cold, vindictive satisfaction. "There," she exclaimed, slamming her palm down into the table. "There, Charles. Did I not tell you? Did I not warn you of the dangers of this family's shocking lack of restraint? Miss Elizabeth's forwardness, her notorious indelicacy in seeking out gentlemen. This is the natural consequence of her improper manners and her low connections. She has paid the price for her lack of modesty." "Do not be cruel, Caroline," Bingley cried, aghast. "She is ruined, utterly ruined. No respectable man will approach her now. And think of dear Miss Bennet. How can she possibly marry me when her sister has brought such indelible shame upon their name?" Darcy remained outwardly immobile, yet his mind was a storm. He remembered Elizabeth's quick wit, her defiant eyes, the beautiful scorn with which she had scorned him. To think of Wickham, the villain he had known since childhood, perpetrating such a public, devastating act. It confirmed every vile suspicion he had ever harbored. But worse than the confirmation of Wickham's depravity was the sudden, shocking realization of what this meant for Elizabeth. Her reputation was not merely bruised, it was destroyed. A woman could perhaps weather private scandal, but a forced public violation, followed immediately by the rejection of the man who caused it, left her without recourse. She was socially dead. He looked at Bingley's genuine distress and felt a surge of painful responsibility. He, Darcy, knew Wickham was a liar and a scoundrel capable of anything. He had concealed the full truth of Wickham's dealings with Georgiana out of pride and a desire to avoid scandal, and now a woman he found himself respecting, perhaps even growing to love, had paid the price for his silence. He forced himself to speak, his voice gravely precise. "Where exactly did this occur in Meryton?" "By the haberdashers, they say." "In full view of the principal street," Bingley whispered. "Then there is no denying the testimony," Darcy murmured, his jaw flexing. He crumpled the corner of the newspaper beneath his hand. Caroline, mistaking his gravity for agreement with her condemnation, leaned closer. "It will be necessary, Mr. Darcy, to immediately address the situation with Charles. This scandalous association must be severed. He cannot possibly continue to call upon Miss Jane Bennet. We must leave Netherfield." Darcy ignored her completely. He was viewing the scene as it must have happened. Elizabeth, startled, defiant, her cheeks flushed with horror, fighting off the hand of a man who preyed on women and whose cruelty was boundless. Darcy saw the spirit he admired crushed by the world's judgment. "The most immediate consequence," Darcy stated, looking at Bingley, his expression unreadable, "is that the disgrace will attach to the entire family, just as Miss Bingley suggests. The severity of the blow must not be underestimated. This is not merely gossip, Bingley. It is social annihilation." "What is to be done then?" Bingley pleaded. "Is there anything? Can Wickham be forced to marry her?" "He cannot," Darcy replied instantly. "He acted publicly, but did not carry out the final indignity that might compel a marriage settlement. He has left her with just enough evidence to ruin her, but not enough legal claim to bind him. Wickham is a master of calculated malice." Darcy stood up, pushing his chair away with quiet force. The room watched him, waiting for his counsel. His face was pale, his composure absolute, but the decision he made in that moment was stark and sudden. He was going to Meryton. He was going to find out the precise truth, and then he was going to expose George Wickham for the monster he was, regardless of the scandal it brought upon his own name. "Bingley," Darcy said, his voice hard as tempered steel, "I advise you to keep silence on the matter, save for your immediate family. I shall ride out to Meryton myself, not to associate with the disgrace, but to understand its exact dimensions." He gave a curt nod, leaving his unfinished breakfast and his stunned companions. For Darcy knew this much. Whether she was ruined or not, Elizabeth Bennet stood in immediate terrible peril, and his silence had contributed to her downfall. He could no longer stand by and watch Wickham destroy a life he had come to value. Chapter 6. The Colonel's office was a shrine to disciplined order. Maps charting campaigns long past hung geometrically accurate on the walls, and the mahogany desk, polished to a mirror sheen, held only the necessary instruments of command: an inkwell, a regulation ledger, and a polished brass paperweight. Fitzwilliam Darcy stood before Colonel Foster, his posture as rigorous as the room itself. The afternoon sun, filtered through the barracks window, illuminated the packet of documents Darcy held, a damning, neatly secured bundle tied with plain white twine. "Colonel Foster," Darcy began, his voice low and devoid of unnecessary inflection, "I appreciate your granting me this time. We are here to discuss George Wickham." The Colonel, a stout man whose face bore the indelible markings of sun and rigorous routine, merely nodded. His expression was a grim mask of weary expectation. Wickham's notoriety had already been whispered through the ranks. The regiment's pride was suffering a slow, humiliating bleed. "I have taken the liberty of compiling a comprehensive account of Mr. Wickham's financial engagements over the last several years," Darcy stated. He placed the heavy packet squarely on the desk. The sound was surprisingly loud in the quiet room. "These, sir, are the receipts." Colonel Foster did not immediately touch them. He looked instead at Darcy, recognizing the immense scope of the favor already rendered. "I know the scoundrel has been demanding and loose-lipped," the Colonel admitted, his jaw clenching. "But I had hoped the issue remained confined to minor gaming debts, easily covered by a generous relative, perhaps." "Hardly minor, Colonel," Darcy corrected, a hint of steel entering his tone. "And the generous relative has been myself. These receipts detail monies paid by me over the period of his adult life, covering everything from tailor's bills in London to far more significant obligations incurred at cards and over transactions I can only describe as morally dubious." Darcy proceeded to unpack the contents verbally, omitting nothing. He spoke of amounts that would bankrupt a small estate, of creditors appeased, and of the constant, wearying necessity of intervention. "Why, Mr. Darcy?" Foster demanded, leaning forward. Why shield him for so long? My reasons were twofold, Colonel. Initially, I felt a duty to my father's memory, who had an unfortunate familial connection to the man. More recently, however, these payments were made to ensure that the stain of Wickham's private depravity did not openly corrupt the honor of your regiment. Darcy tapped the packet. I paid these debts, sir, to keep Wickham in uniform and out of the public eye. My own reputation suffered merely a private inconvenience. Yours would have endured a scandal. The colonel's face flushed a deep crimson of humiliation and anger. The very foundation of military life was integrity and trust. Wickham had polluted it. And now, Colonel Foster managed to ask, you have ceased your protection? I have, Darcy confirmed. I have settled all his old accounts, thus preventing any residual smear upon my own house. But there are new debts, Colonel. Fresh obligations incurred over the last 6 months alone. Debts I have pointedly refused to honor. Darcy let the silence stretch, allowing the colonel to calculate the inevitable consequences. Without Darcy's vast fortune acting as an unseen shield, Wickham had only weeks, perhaps days, before his creditors lost patience. The process will be swift, Darcy elaborated, his eyes fixed on the distant parade ground visible through the window. Once the first warrant is issued for default, the others will follow with predatory speed. He will be taken to a debtor's prison, most likely the King's Bench or the Fleet. Colonel Foster absorbed the reality. Debtor's prison was a vile, ruinous place, but it was also a means of permanent removal. It was a scandal contained within stone walls, far away from the meticulous order of the barracks. The disgrace was private and final, not public and prolonged. He is a soldier, the colonel muttered, rubbing his temples, and he has been an utter disaster. His charm, his facility for easy conversation, it was all a thin veneer over a core of pure, grasping rot. He looked down at the receipts, recognizing them not as pieces of paper, but as the evidence of a deep, professional betrayal. Wickham was not just a rake. He was a liability that threatened the integrity of the institution. A debtor's prison, Colonel Foster repeated, a strange, cold satisfaction dawning in his eyes. While a civilian fate, it is a definitive end to his military career. Indeed, Darcy agreed, he will be detained in a manner that renders him incapable of further mischief or of trading upon the good name of the regiment for at least the foreseeable future. The creditors will have him. A slow, hard smile stretched across the colonel's face, a grimace more than an expression of true happiness. Mr. Darcy, for the honor of the regiment and the sanity of its officers, I wholeheartedly concur with your cessation of payment. He rose, pushing his chair back, the noise brief and sharp. It is the only solution that ensures his silence and his absence. He has stained our reputation long enough. Let him face the consequences he so meticulously engineered. Darcy inclined his head. The matter was concluded. The conversation had been one of necessary cruelty, a surgical strike to remove a source of infection. Then I shall take my leave, Colonel, Darcy said. As Darcy turned towards the door, the colonel placed his hands on the packet of receipts, evidence of a vice he no longer had to cover. Thank you, Mr. Darcy, Colonel Foster said, his voice now crisp and military once more. You have done the regiment a singular service. We shall ensure the paperwork detailing his desertion, or rather his unavailability due to unavoidable private circumstances, is processed with utmost expedition. Darcy left the colonel standing alone. Outside, the world was bright and disciplined. Wickham's fate, secured by the weight of proof and the cold calculus of reputation, was sealed. He would be removed, not by the sword, but by the pen of the law, vanishing into the squalor he was owed. Chapter 7. The air in Meryton had grown heavy, not with the pleasant scent of autumn leaves or baking bread, but with the suffocating fumes of ruined reputation. The news, a chaotic mix of truth, exaggeration, and righteous indignation, had not walked but sprinted through the town. It began with the near disgrace of Elizabeth, an event so narrowly averted that most of Meryton only knew the shadow it cast. A darkness had fallen over the Bennet household, quickly followed by a blinding flash of truth. The source of the trouble was the charming, smiling Lieutenant Wickham. Every parlor, tavern, and milliner's shop became a council of war against the vanished officer. The turning point was the sudden, satisfying, and utter humiliation of his arrest. Wickham, who had borrowed from nearly every tradesman and gentleman in the village, promising repayment with checks as worthless as husks, was publicly removed from the lodging he shared near the barracks. Arrested not for seduction, which was a social crime, but for the sin of debt. The speed with which Meryton's collective heart turned from infatuation to ferocious hatred was astonishing, even by their own standards. "Debtor's jail, I hear," whispered Mrs. Long to Sir William Lucas, her eyes wide with a relish that bordered on feverish enjoyment. They stood outside the apothecary's, ostensibly discussing influenza, but their real topic was the delicious moral comeuppance of the villain. "The King's Bench, madam," Sir William affirmed, puffing out his chest, "and not a penny to pay his way out. He is consumed by debt, a genuine rogue. Why, that poor man Evans, the tailor, he is out £50. 50, the effrontery of the man, to smile and flatter while he steals the very shirt off a poor man's back." Wickham's descent was rapid and brutal. The same people who had swooned over his uniform and lamented his supposed ill treatment by the haughty Mr. Darcy now openly celebrated his imprisonment. It was a release, a purification of Meryton's social calendar. "And to think," mused Mrs. Higgins, peering over her spectacles, "we welcomed him. We thought him a victim. But a man who would leave a young lady of Miss Bennet's family ruined and then try to swindle the parish clerk? He is a snake, a mere snake." The news that he was truly, miserably penniless, stuck in the squalor of a prison, was greeted with a communal sigh of satisfaction. As Wickham's star plunged into the mud, Mr. Darcy's reputation began its sudden, brilliant ascent. The catalyst was the realization of what had saved them. Someone had stepped in. Someone had paid Wickham's crushing debts. And that someone, it could only be Darcy. The scattered threads of Wickham's carefully woven lies began to unravel at tremendous speed, exposing the bare bones of his deceit. The story of the stolen living, the ruined inheritance, Darcy's poverty, it was all suddenly inverted. Meryton had initially embraced Wickham's narrative because he was charming and because it was satisfying to take down the mighty. Darcy, with his impenetrable reserve and proud carriage, had been the perfect villain. Now every instance of Darcy's coldness was reinterpreted as dignity. His silence was wisdom. His wealth was not in fairy tale, but proof of his solid ethical standing. "He is a gentleman of the highest order," declared Sir William, performing a spectacular volte-face with practiced ease. "A man of probity, stability, and fortune. We were all blind to the truth, swayed by the cheap smiles of a mountebank. The lies Wickham had spread about Darcy's cruelty, his pride, his poverty, were now seen not as genuine grievances, but as the desperate machinations of a man drowning in debt and sin. Darcy's actions spoke louder than any of Wickham's polished words. He had rescued many shopkeepers not connected to him by blood, and he had done so without seeking praise or recognition. The Meryton Society now agreed. Mr. Darcy was not merely wealthy, he was prosperous, a profound distinction in their minds. Prosperity implied not just money, but a well-managed estate, secure investments, and crucially, a virtuous character that attracted divine favor. The reversal was complete. Where contempt had reigned, admiration flourished. Meryton was delighted to have the moral order restored, to see the villain ruined and the true hero reveal himself. Although the Meryton Society now received Darcy with open arms, the disgrace of the Bennet family could not be forgot so easily. Elizabeth, and the whole family with her, was pitied but still avoided. Chapter 8. The air in Mr. Bennet's library was thick with the scent of old books and unspoken despair. The recent catastrophe of Elizabeth's open ruin by George Wickham had settled over Longbourn like a perpetual fog, choking the joy from its halls. It was into this stifling quiet that Fitzwilliam Darcy was shown, his tall frame and grave countenance seeming to suck the remaining air from the room. Mr. Bennet, who had aged a decade and a fortnight, did not rise from his chair behind the great oak desk. His wit, that once sharp weapon, was sheathed in pure exhaustion. "Mr. Darcy," he said, his voice flat, "to what do we owe this honor? Come to witness the final act of our farce?" Darcy's jaw tightened. He stood perfectly straight, his black coat impeccable, a stark contrast to the disarray of the household. "No, sir. I come to offer my most sincere condolences on your family's recent misfortune." A dry, humorless laugh escaped Mr. Bennet. "Misfortune is a spilled glass of port, sir. This is a cataclysm. The Bennet name is now a punchline in every gentleman's club from here to London. My wife is prostrate, Elizabeth is ruined, and my other daughters are blighted by association." He spoke the words as if reading a grim ledger of facts. "Your condolences are noted, but I doubt they are the sole purpose of your visit." Darcy did not flinch. He had expected no less. He took a measured breath, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond Mr. Bennet's shoulder, where a dusty volume of Gibbon's history stood. Some empires fell, he thought, not with a bang, but with a whisper of scandal. "You are correct," Darcy said, his voice low and deliberate. "I have a proposition, an offer which I hope you will consider." Mr. Bennet raised a bushy eyebrow, a flicker of his old curiosity returning. "An offer? From you? We are not exactly in a position to invest in Derbyshire ventures, Mr. Darcy. It is not a matter of business, it is a matter of family." Darcy's eyes finally met Mr. Bennet's. "I am here to offer marriage to your daughter, Elizabeth." The silence that followed was absolute. Mr. Bennet stared, his spectacles slipping down his nose. He slowly pushed them back up, as if needing a clearer view of this most perplexing of men. Mr. Bennet leaned back in his leather chair, which creaked in protest. He steepled his fingers, studying his unexpected guest. "Elizabeth, you wish to marry my Lizzie, now, in the immediate, rather pungent aftermath of this disgrace?" He paused, his keen eyes searching Darcy's face for any sign of mockery or deceit. "You must explain yourself, sir. For the life of me, I cannot fathom it. Why would a man of your standing, your wealth, your infamous pride, choose to chain himself to a family in such utter disarray? Why would you seek to marry a disgraced woman? I require an answer, Mr. Darcy. Not a practiced speech, but the truth." Darcy looked down at his gloves, clenched tightly in one hand. He had rehearsed this, but no rehearsal could capture the raw ache in his chest. When he looked up, his guard was down. The haughty mask was gone, replaced by a vulnerability that Mr. Bennet would never have believed possible. "The truth, sir, is," Darcy said, his voice rough with emotion, "I love her. I have loved her for many weeks. I love her mind, her spirit, her goodness, and I cannot stand to see her in such distress. I cannot be a passive spectator to her suffering. To see her light extinguished by this misery is a torment I will not abide. If I can shield her from even a fraction of it, if I can offer her my name and my protection to deflect the worst of the scorn, then I must. I am compelled to." Mr. Bennet was utterly still. He saw it now, the genuine anguish, the fervent devotion in the young man's eyes. This was not calculation. This was a man utterly and completely in love, offering himself as a human shield for the woman he cherished. After a long moment, Mr. Bennet sighed, a sound of profound weariness and unexpected relief. "Well," he murmured, "I believe you." He rose slowly. "I cannot speak for her, sir. Only she can. But for my part, I would welcome it." He moved to the door and called out into the hallway, "Lizzie, come here, child, if you please." Elizabeth appeared moments later. She was pale, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, her usual vitality subdued into a quiet dignity that broke Darcy's heart afresh. She glanced at him, confusion and wariness in her expression, before looking to her father. "Lizzie," Mr. Bennet said gently, "Mr. Darcy has done us the great honor of making you an offer of marriage. And before you speak, know that he has given me his reasons, and I have found them to be astonishingly sound. Elizabeth's eyes widened in sheer shock. She looked at Darcy, who met her gaze with a silent, pleading intensity. For a single wild moment, a vision flashed in her mind, a life of comfort, of protection for her family, of intellectual companionship with this brilliant, complex man. A life with the man she had, to her own recent and horrifying discovery, come to respect. But the vision shattered as quickly as it formed, crushed under the weight of stark, unbearable reality. She took a step back, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "No," she whispered, then finding her voice, stronger now, laced with a painful resolve. "No, I cannot accept." Darcy's face fell. "Elizabeth, please." "You are generous," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "You are noble to make such an offer in our darkest hour, but I cannot let you make such a sacrifice." "It is not a sacrifice to me," he urged, taking a step toward her. "It is my deepest wish." "But it would become one," she cried, her composure cracking. "How could it not? You must see the impossibility of it. I have openly disdained you, sir. I have accused you, and I have believed the worst of you based on the lies of a scoundrel. To now become your wife would be a constant living reminder of my own prejudice and folly. I would see it in your eyes every day." She drew a shuddering breath, pressing on before her courage failed her. "And that is before the world has its say. You have not been publicly disgraced, Mr. Darcy. I have, my family has. To marry me now would be to tar yourself and the proud name of Pemberley with the same brush that has blackened ours. You would be shunned by your own circle. Your sister prospects would be harmed. You would be marrying the woman that was disgraced by George Wickham." She said the name like a curse, her voice thick with shame. "I will not be the ruin of you. I will not let you sink yourself out of some misplaced sense of chivalry. I will not let you destroy yourself for my sake." She turned and fled the room, the sound of her hurried footsteps echoing in the dreadful silence she left behind. Darcy stood rooted to the spot, devastated by her refusal, yet utterly awestruck by her. Even in her deepest humiliation, her integrity shone brighter than any concern for her own comfort. She was protecting him. Mr. Bennet sank back into his chair, a profound sadness in his eyes. "You see, Mr. Darcy, what you are dealing with. You offered your fortune and your name. She, in return, offered you the only thing she has left, her honor. She has just saved you from yourself." Darcy looked at the empty doorway, his heart a battlefield of despair and a fiercer, more determined love than he had ever known. She had refused him to save him. It was the most magnificent, most heartbreaking thing he had ever witnessed, and it made him absolutely determined to win her. Chapter 9. The door of Mr. Bennet's library closed behind Mr. Darcy with a soft yet decisive click, sealing away the intellectual clutter and the remnants of their intensely charged, though unfinished, conversation. A footman, stationed nervously in the hall, had confirmed the direction of Miss Elizabeth's impetuous retreat. "To the ground, sir. She took the west path, toward the mount. She ran, sir. Did not even secure her cloak." Darcy did not stop to retrieve his own gloves. The brief, frantic image of Elizabeth fleeing into the cold gray afternoon was enough to override every instinct for propriety and comfort. The grounds of Longbourn were already a sodden tragedy. They had endured 3 days of relentless autumnal rain, turning the carefully manicured paths into slick, treacherous mudslides. Darcy stepped off the portico and immediately felt the sickening slurp of the earth beneath his heavy boots. The air was thick, cold, and smelled sharply of decaying leaves and wet soil. The rain was not a delicate shower. It was a determined, vertical deluge, beating down the remaining leaves and creating miniature, rushing rivers in every rut. Darcy pulled his collar high, ignoring the immediate penetration of the dampness against his shoulders. His finely tailored coat was already failing in its duty. He followed the track the footman had indicated, the west path. This was the route Elizabeth routinely took when her mind required solitude, a place where the grandeur of nature could soothe her sharper emotions. Oakham Mount. The path twisted through a small coppice, where the light was already failing due to the oppressive shroud of the weather. Here, the mud was deeper, clinging to his heels with viscous determination. He searched desperately for any sign, a small footprint, perhaps a piece of the disregarded cloak, but the heavy downpour was an efficient eraser. Every trace of Elizabeth's light passage was instantly absorbed and dissolved by the churning mire. Darcy pressed on with a growing sense of urgency that bordered on panic. This was not simply a chase, it was a rescue, for he understood that Elizabeth, though spirited, was vulnerable to the conditions. The ground was treacherous. If she had fallen, or worse, if the swollen stream they had to cross had overflowed its narrow stone bridge, he broke out of the shelter of the trees onto a field that gently sloped upwards toward the landmark. Wickham Mount was not a true mountain, but a distinctive rise in the landscape, crowned by a single immense ancient oak that was said to have stood since the time of the Tudors. In fine weather, it offered a panoramic view of Hertfordshire. Today it was merely an isolated, windswept beacon of misery. The ascent was a battle against the elements. The wind, funneling over the exposed terrain, tore at his clothing and drove the rain violently into his face, stinging his eyes and blurring his vision. He could taste the adrenaline and the clean, cold water. He had never undertaken such a reckless, penitential path in his life, yet he felt immune to the discomfort, driven solely by the singular thought of her safety. Finally, lungs burning and his coat heavy with water, he reached the crest. He stumbled onto the small, grassless plateau. The great oak stood before him. Its branches were black and skeletal against the churning gray sky, weeping torrents of rain onto the ground below. Darcy stopped beneath its canopy, panting, heedless of the water still streaming off his hat. He scanned the entire summit, spinning slowly on his heel. There was no one. The ground around the oak was clear. No figure huddled against the trunk, no slight form seeking shelter behind the low protective stone wall sometimes used by picnickers. The wind howled a low, disconsolate note through the ancient leaves. But otherwise, the summit was empty. Darcy squinted, peering down the various slopes, trying to ascertain if she had continued past the peak, or perhaps taken one of the lesser-used side paths back toward the village. But the distance was too great, and the sheeting rain rendered anything beyond 50 yards indistinct, a watery blur of brown and green. His heart sank, a heavy leaden weight. He had pursued her to her known sanctuary, her intended refuge, and found only the relentless evidence of the storm. Elizabeth was nowhere on Wickham Mount. He was thoroughly soaked, shivering despite the heat of his exertion, and suddenly seized by a terrifying realization. The rain had done its work too well. Her path had been erased, her destination empty. She had either fled beyond this familiar spot, or worse, something had happened to her on the muddy, perilous route, and he had simply walked past the evidence, washed clean by the flood. He stood alone under the dripping oak, the vast, empty landscape confirming his failure. He had followed the path, but the path had offered no sign, only a deepening fear of what lay beyond the boundaries of his expectation. He had to decide instantly, retreat back toward Longbourn and raise the alarm, or follow the path downward, blindly searching the flooded hollows for a trace of the woman he now realized he could not bear to lose. Chapter 10. Darcy, soaked through to the bone, felt the heavy, waterlogged fabric of his coat dragging at him with every desperate stride. Visibility was poor, the world reduced to shades of sodden green and viscous brown, blurred by the deluge. He had been scanning the ravine edges and the thicker copses beside the path back to Longbourn for over an hour, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm of rising dread. Elizabeth had vanished during the sudden turn in the weather, and his immediate fear had metastasized into absolute terror. The terrain was treacherous even when dry. Now, it was actively hostile. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to breathe deeply. Logic told him she would seek shelter, but instinct, the visceral, agonizing certainty of great danger, pulled him off the main track and toward the steeper, unstable banks that lined the lower path. He stopped then, leaning his gloved hands against the rough, mossy trunk of a gnarled oak, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the rain wash over his face, a raw penance. Please, he thought, the silent prayer, a desperate primal thing ripped from his soul, addressed to a God he rarely troubled with petitions. Let me find her. Let me find her in time. The silence of the mountain, broken only by the loud drumming of the rain and the rush of swollen streams, was unbearable. He was about to push off and continue his frantic search when he heard it. It was not the sharp call of a bird or the wind whistling through the damp foliage. It was a sound thinner than the wind, almost lost beneath the general roar of the water, a fragile thread woven into the tapestry of the storm. A weak, pathetic moan. Then clearer, though infinitely faint, "Help!" Darcy's exhaustion evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure, freezing adrenaline. He spun toward the sound, which seemed to emanate from a low, muddy ridge about 20 yards off the path, where the ground dropped suddenly toward a shallow creek bed. He plunged off the track, sliding down a short, grassy incline, slowing himself only by grasping at exposed tree roots. The mud here was deeper, thicker, the ground visibly disturbed. When he reached the lip of the ridge, his breath caught in his throat, a sharp, ragged gasp of horror. The small creek bank had given way. A recent landslide, perhaps only minutes old, had shorn a wide scar into the earth, sending tons of wet soil, rocks, and uprooted foliage cascading downward. And in the very center of the devastation, where the thick, clay-like mud had settled, was Elizabeth. She was captured entirely, swallowed almost whole by the earth's wet maw. The sliding mud had acted like quicksand, covering her body nearly to her neck. She was tilted awkwardly, her head barely above the brown sludge, her hair plastered dark against her face. She was unrecognizable beneath the layer of filth, her features obscured, her eyes squeezed shut against the impossible weight. Only the top curve of her shoulders and the strained vulnerability of her throat were visible above the suffocating earth. One hand, small and pale, lay palm up, barely free of the clinging mud, trembling slightly in a futile effort to move. She was utterly immobile, entombed, the rain mercilessly washing away the mud from her eyes only to instantly replace it with more. "Elizabeth," Darcy bellowed, the sound ripped from him by sheer terror. Her eyes flickered open, wide and glazed with shock and cold. A single desperate syllable left her lips, more a broken prayer than a greeting. "Darcy!" He dropped to his knees at the edge of the slide, heedless of the unstable ground, his mind already racing with the terrible understanding that this was not a matter of simply pulling her out. The mud held her with the fierce tenacity of cement. She was alive, but she was trapped, sinking, and the mountain was still weeping. He had found her, but now the race against time truly began. Chapter 11. "Mr. Darcy!" Elizabeth cried, her voice a strangled mix of shame and desperate hope. He did not answer with words. His actions were his language. He reached her, the mud now to his own thighs, and began to dig. His hands, those fine, aristocratic hands, plunged into the filth, scraping, clawing, pulling great handfuls of the cold weight away from her. His face was a study in ferocious concentration, streaked with rain and dirt, his breath coming in ragged clouds in the chill air. Elizabeth, her own panic subsiding into a stunned awe, could only watch him, this man of pristine pride, utterly undone for her sake. With a final, sucking gasp, the mud released its prize. He hauled her free, her body limp and shivering against his. But the ordeal was not over. The journey back to solid ground was a nightmare of its own. Every step was a battle against the mire that clung to them, threatening to claim them both. Darcy fought with a strength born of pure desperation, his arms locked around her, his every muscle straining. He would sink, find purchase, and drag them both forward an inch at a time. Finally, with a grunt of supreme effort, he half threw, half pushed her onto the firm grassy bank. She collapsed, gasping, turning immediately to reach for him, to help him the last few feet. He was still mired to his knees, his expression one of exhausted triumph. Their eyes met, a flash of something unspoken, profound, and terrifyingly new passing between them. Oh, it was in that precise, vulnerable moment that the hillside groaned. It was a deep, subterranean rumble that vibrated through the earth. Elizabeth's eyes widened in fresh terror, darting past him to the slope above. Darcy's triumph vanished, replaced by dawning horror as he followed her gaze. The world dissolved into a brown avalanche. It was not a large slide, but it was fast and brutal. A wave of mud and debris, dislodged from higher up the saturated hill, swept down directly upon him. He had no time to react, no hope of outrunning it. It hit him with the force of a tidal wave, tearing his grip from the bank. "Darcy!" Elizabeth's scream was raw, ripped from her very soul. The mud swallowed him whole. One moment he was there, his dark eyes locked on hers, and the next there was only a churning, settling brown surface where he had stood. The silence that followed was more deafening than the slide itself, broken only by the relentless pattering of the rain. Elizabeth stared, frozen, at the placid, monstrous mudflat. Nothing moved. He was simply gone, erased. A sound emerged from her, a wounded animal noise of denial. Then a surge of energy born of absolute despair galvanized her. She scrambled on her hands and knees to the edge, not caring that she was sliding back toward the danger. "Darcy!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Fitzwilliam!" She began to dig. With a frantic, mad energy that mirrored his own, she plunged her hands into the freezing mud, scraping and pulling it away. Her mind was a white-hot void of prayer and panic. She would not let it end like this. She would not lose him. Not now, not after this. Her fingers, numb and bleeding, struck something solid. Fabric. A shoulder. With a sob of effort, she redoubled her digging, clearing the mud from his back, his neck. She found his head, and with a strength she did not know she possessed, she pulled, leveraging his dead weight towards her. He emerged from the earth like a creature being born, pale and lifeless. She dragged him onto the bank, rolling him onto his back. Mud caked his face, filled his mouth. He was not breathing. Terrified, acting on an instinct she did not understand, she cleared his airway with her fingers and pressed on his chest, her tears mixing with the rain on his still face. "You cannot," she whispered, a desperate litany. "You cannot leave me, not like this. Please." A convulsive shudder racked his body. He choked, a horrible, beautiful sound, and a stream of muddy water erupted from his lips. He gasped, a ragged, sucking breath of air, and his eyes fluttered open. They were clouded with confusion and pain, but they found hers. For a long moment, they simply lay there in the rain, the elegant Mr. Darcy and the willful Elizabeth Bennet, two battered, filthy souls on a riverbank, saved by each other. He reached a trembling, mud-caked hand and very gently brushed a strand of wet hair from her cheek. His voice, when it came, was a hoarse whisper, but the words were perfectly clear. "Elizabeth," he breathed, "you are safe." Chapter 12. Elizabeth woke to the smell of lavender and freshly starched linen. She was in her bed at Longbourn. The ceiling was familiar, the pale morning light filtering through the muslin curtains, a benevolent intrusion. But the comfort was a cruel joke. Every muscle in her body screamed, a tapestry of deep, widespread bruises making her skin feel alien and tight. She was clean. The thick, cold layer of mud, grit, and pine needles that had encased her was gone. Someone, likely Jane and perhaps Mrs. Hill, had painstakingly removed the terror from her person, leaving her dressed in the cleanest, softest cambric nightgown. She touched her temple. A throbbing ache punctuated the spot where she must have struck a stone. The memory rushed back, not as a flood, but as a grinding torrent of earth and noise. The hillside above the path had groaned, a sound she would never forget, and then the world had collapsed. Darcy. He had been right there. She remembered his shout, the fierce urgency of his grip as he threw her clear, propelling her into the meager shelter of an ancient oak root just as the next wave of earth struck. She had been safe, relatively speaking, cushioned by a mound of ancient foliage. But he had stood exposed, turning to face the direction she had been saved. Only for a second, but it was enough for the far more violent secondary landslide, loosened by the initial tremor, to sweep down with the force of a battering ram. The sound it made was not just a roar, it was the sound of destruction. She had fought her way out of the mud, scrambling back down the broken earth. Her fingers scraped raw. She had found him half submerged, his dark clothes indistinguishable from the wet red clay. He was still, frighteningly still. She had dragged his heavy, unresponsive body to less treacherous ground, whispering his name until her throat was hoarse. Then, there was the blessed, booming voice of her father. By some miracle, or perhaps alerted by some noise carried on the wind, Mr. Bennet had ridden out with 3 of the stoutest footmen. They had covered the distance with remarkable speed and efficiency, constructing a stretcher from broken branches and coats, carrying them both back through the twilight woods to the security of Longbourn. Now she was safe, but the quiet safety felt unbearable. "Elizabeth, my dearest, you are awake." Jane was sitting beside the bed, her embroidery forgotten in her lap. Her sister's face, usually so serene, was etched with fatigue and anxiety. She looked as though she hadn't slept in days. Elizabeth grasped Jane's hand, the familiar touch a small anchor in the storm of her fear. "Jane!" Elizabeth's voice was dry, a whispered rasp. The question was not just the first thing on her mind. It was the only thing. "Mr. Darcy, is he? Where is he?" Jane gently squeezed her hand, avoiding her eyes as she pushed a loose strand of hair from Elizabeth's face. "He is here, Eliza. Papa would suffer him nowhere else. He is in the blue room, just across the hall." A surge of relief, sharp and dizzying, washed over Elizabeth. He was near. He was under her roof. "He is awake? Does he know I am well?" Elizabeth pressed, trying to read the truth in the minute tremor of Jane's lips. Jane's gaze finally locked on hers, and the tenderness in her eyes was replaced by a profound shadow of distress. "No, my love, he is not. He has been unconscious since they brought him in." The words landed like a fresh, heavy stone on Elizabeth's chest, stealing her breath. She closed her eyes for a moment, seeing again the terrible stillness of his face. "The physician?" she finally managed. "Dr. Wilson and the surgeon from Meryton have both been here," Jane said softly, her voice wavering dangerously. She rose, moving to the window as if the light would help her speak the dreadful truth. "They bled him, which seemed to do little more than diminish his strength. He has a severe concussion, and they fear internal injury from the force of the impact." Jane turned back, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. She walked back to the bed and sat on the edge, taking Elizabeth's hands in both of hers, grounding her in the moment. "Elizabeth," she whispered, her voice cracking with forced control. "He has not stirred since Papa found him. He does not respond. They say that unless he wakes within the next day, there is not much hope that he will survive." The room seemed to shrink, the gentle morning light turning cold. Elizabeth stared at her sister, the sound of the word hope echoing hollowly in the sudden, absolute silence of the bedroom. She had been saved. He had saved her, using his body as a shield against the fury of nature. And now, lying just a few yards away, the man who had only recently found his way into her heart was fighting a solitary battle against death, a battle he was doomed to lose. A tremor ran through Elizabeth, not of fear, but of a desolate, consuming grief. She felt, despite her weakness, an immediate, irrational fury at the world, at fate, at the cruel injustice that would allow such nobility to be extinguished while she, the recipient of his sacrifice, lay safe and warm. "I must see him, Jane," Elizabeth whispered, trying to pull her bruised limbs from beneath the heavy counterpane. "I must see him now." Chapter 13. The air in the chamber was thick with the scent of weak tea and medicinal herbs. Sunlight, filtered through heavy curtains, fell in dusty strips across the floor, illuminating the oppressive quiet. Jane sat beside the bed, her expression a careful mask of anxiety, watching Elizabeth struggle even in repose. Elizabeth, however, was heedless of her own feverish weakness. Her mind was entirely fixed on the room across the hall. "Jane," Elizabeth finally whispered, her voice reedy and stretched thin by recent illness. "I must see him. I must." Jane sighed, smoothing the coverlet over Elizabeth's motionless legs. "Dearest, you are still too weak to stand. You were insensible with fever only hours ago. And even if you could walk, think of the consequences. For you to go, unchaperoned, to the room of an unconscious bachelor who is barely more than a stranger." Elizabeth's eyes flashed with a sudden, painful clarity. "Stop, Jane. Do not speak of propriety." She pushed herself up onto her elbows, the movement causing the room to tilt sickeningly. She gritted her teeth against the wave of dizziness. "Propriety?" Elizabeth repeated, the words sounding hollow and cheap in the face of what had occurred. "My reputation has already been ruined. Wickham saw to that, dragging my name through the deepest mire of society. I have nothing left to lose in the eyes of the world." She leaned closer to her sister, her gaze fierce. "But Mr. Darcy, he saved me. He saw the shift in the rock, the crumbling edge of the path. He threw himself to save me, wrenching me back from the landslide, with the risk of losing his own life." A tear escaped and tracked a hot path down her pale cheek. "He is lying there, perhaps dying because of me, because his honor is so much greater than the value he placed on his own safety. I do not care what the world thinks. I must see the cost of my life written upon his face." Jane knew the argument was lost. When Elizabeth's moral conviction reached this pitch, no social barrier could hold her back. "Lizzie, please," Jane pleaded one last time, reaching out a hand. "Let me send for the physician's report. You are trembling." Elizabeth ignored the plea. Gathering every ounce of her depleted physical resource, she pushed the covers aside. Her feet found the chilling wood of the floor. The simple action of standing was monumental. Her knees buckled immediately, and she had to grip the heavy mahogany bedpost, leaning against it until the worst of the nausea passed. Sweat broke instantly upon her brow. She looked to Jane, her face white and drawn, but her expression infused with inviolable determination. "I am going." Jane realized that attempting to physically restrain her would only lead to a dangerous fall. She moved instantly to Elizabeth's side, offering her shoulder for support. With a profound, slow effort that felt like swimming against a strong current, Elizabeth began to move. It was not a walk, but an excruciating, limping shuffle. Jane bore most of her weight, guiding her sister through the dim, silent hallway. Each short step was an act of agonizing defiance against her own failing body. The distance to Darcy's room, usually negligible, felt miles long. When they reached the door, Elizabeth paused, pushing Jane away gently. She needed to approach this final threshold alone. Taking a deep, shaky breath that did nothing to calm her racing heart, Elizabeth gripped the cold brass handle and pushed the door open. The room was cool and quiet. A single lamp burned low beside the bed, casting deep shadows that made the figure lying there seem spectral. Elizabeth's breath hitched. Mr. Darcy lay utterly still. His face was shockingly pale, a stark contrast to the white pillowcase. An elaborate bandage wrapped around his head and forehead spoke silently of the blow he had received protecting her. His chest rose and fell shallowly, a sign of life, yet terrifyingly fragile. No proud elegance remained, only raw vulnerability. Elizabeth pushed herself across the final few feet of the floor, not caring that she stumbled slightly against a chair. She reached the bedside and looked down at him, her heart tearing in her chest. This man whom she had so haughtily judged and misconstrued had offered his life for hers. The Wickham scandal had ruined her reputation. Darcy's sacrifice had salvaged her very existence. Seeing him laid low by such an act crushed every remaining vestige of her Pride and Prejudice. She could not speak, for the strength in her voice had died upon viewing him. With the last of her weak strength, she raised a hand, a trembling feather touching a statue, and gently, barely touching, traced the pale line of his cheekbone. The world outside the chamber, with its concerns of propriety and gossip, ceased to exist. In this room there was only the silent, living debt connecting the saved to the Savior. Elizabeth knew with a certainty that transcended illness and fear that she was irrevocably bound to him now, her fate sealed not by law or love letters, but by rock, earth, and blood. Chapter 14. The hour was deeply unkind, possessing that exhausted stillness which precedes the dawn. In the large, darkened bedchamber at Longbourn, every sound, the soft tick of the mantel clock, the hiss of the dying embers, the shallow intake of her own breath, was magnified into a painful drumming. Elizabeth sat on the chair beside the carved oak bed, where Fitzwilliam Darcy lay trapped in a perilous, feverish sleep. His face, usually so commanding and vital, was ghost-white against the linens, etched only with the deep lines of pain. She had not slept, not truly. Sleep was a luxury reserved for those who were not forced to witness the fragility of the life they cherished most. Her gown was rumpled, her hair had escaped its pins, and her eyes were raw with a grief that had no polite bounds. Elizabeth felt the familiar hot rush of anguish rise in her throat again. She did not bother to stifle it. Propriety and composure had withered away under the sheer weight of her fear. And she lifted his hand, the strong, long-fingered hand that had once written her a letter of stinging reproach, and later one of enduring devotion. It felt slack and cool in her grasp. She pressed it against her wet cheek, the rough linen of his sleeve scratching her skin. The dam broke. A deep, ragged sob tore free, a sound unlike any she had ever made, primitive and devastating. "Darcy," she choked out, the name a plea. "You must not leave me. You must not." Her tears, which had flowed in a steady, silent stream for hours, now poured with violent speed, wetting the back of his hand. It was in this moment of utter despair, stripped bare of all pride and reserve, that she finally voiced the truth that his potential loss had hammered into her soul. "I know I waited too long to say it," she whispered fiercely, gripping his hand so tight her knuckles were white. "I was foolish and proud and afraid, but I am not afraid now, only terrified of a world without you." She leaned low over the bed, her voice dissolving into a desperate broken murmur. "I need you, Darcy. Do you hear me? I need your strength, your temper, your terrible kindness. I need you to criticize my piano playing and mock my long walks. I need you to be here." Her head dropped onto the side of the pillow near his shoulder, her confession rising to a desperate crescendo, the words tearing from her very core. "I love you," she sobbed, the force of the declaration shaking her small frame. "God help me, if you leave me now, I shall never forgive you. I love you, Fitzwilliam. You cannot die." She lay there trembling, waiting for the devastating silence to answer her, feeling the cold finality of the room settling over her like a shroud. Then, against the deafening anguish of her own weeping, she felt it, a minuscule pressure, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in the hand she held. Elizabeth froze. She lifted her head, her breath catching instantly. Had she imagined it? The fever could sometimes cause slight spasms. She looked at his face, rigid, pale, and utterly lifeless. But as she stared agonizingly at the severity of his brow, she saw the slightest flutter beneath his eyelid. It was quicker than a cough, softer than a sigh, yet it paralyzed her. She held her breath, waiting, fearing that if she shifted even an inch, the fragile illusion would shatter. Slowly, painfully, as if fighting through layers of linen and stone, Darcy opened his eyes. They were unfocused at first, hazy and distant, fixed on the ceiling, struggling to anchor in reality. Then, with an effort that cost him visible pain, they flickered downward. His gaze found her, her tear-streaked face, her disheveled hair, the desperation clinging to her like a second skin. The recognition, dim but certain, dawned in their deep gray depths. A faint, dry tremor parted his lips. The sound he made was barely a breath. A filament of air dragged from deep within his chest, yet it cut through the silence of the sick room like a bell. He whispered one word. The sound weighted with exhaustion and profound relief. The only word he needed to utter to bring the world rushing back into focus. Elizabeth. Chapter 15. Elizabeth sat beside her fiancé in the Meryton church, waiting for the parson to begin his sermon. The polished mahogany of the pew felt solid beneath her fingertips, a stark contrast to the churning anxiety she had so recently known. She shifted slightly, acutely aware of the warmth radiating from the large, powerful shoulder pressed next to hers. Fitzwilliam Darcy was present, whole in hers. This simple truth still felt like a miracle wrested from the jaws of catastrophe. His recovery was slow, precisely as the village physician had warned, but steady. He carried himself with a new, quiet appreciation for stillness. His hand resting on the velvet cushion was strong, but she remembered too vividly the weeks when it had been slack and cold. The landslide had been a blind, brutal force, ripping apart the landscape and shattering their established distance in a single, terrifying instant. The weeks that followed had been a blur of linen, broths, anxious whispers, and the shocking revelation of her own resilience. She had found her strength quicker than expected, shedding the persona of the witty, perhaps frivolous, Miss Bennet, and embracing the role of the devoted caregiver. There had been no room for pride or petty resentment when life hung by a thread. That shared ordeal, begun in terror and cemented in exhaustion, had stripped away all artifice. He had seen her at her most practical and least composed. She had seen him at his most vulnerable and least guarded. Now, sitting here in the humdrum peace of a Sunday morning, awaiting the third reading of their banns, she contemplated the total turnaround of her existence. It was impossible to ignore the profound shame that accompanied the present joy. Only a couple of months prior, she had loathed this man. She had painted him with the darkest colors of arrogance and cruelty. She had judged him wholly, utterly, and with a terrible, self-righteous conviction that now made her cheeks burn. She recalled the ease with which she had swallowed Wickham's lies that flattered her sense of persecution and confirmed her low opinion of the wealthy. Her prejudice had been a comfortable cloak, protecting her from the inconvenience of deeper thought. How blind she had been, how utterly stupid to believe in the soft-spoken villain merely because his tale aligned with her preconceived notions of Darcy's pride. It was not Darcy's confession at some grand estate that had truly broken her error. It was watching him fight for his life to rescue her, and recognizing the unwavering moral core beneath the stiffness that had finally, brutally, educated her. A small sigh escaped her, scarcely audible above the rustle of Mrs. Long's skirts in the neighboring pew. She felt a gentle pressure on her arm. Darcy had turned his head slightly, his eyes holding a question. She managed a fleeting, reassuring smile. Only gratitude, she mouthed silently. And it was gratitude, immense and overwhelming. Gratitude that he had survived. Gratitude that the accident, which had threatened to steal everything, had instead gifted her clarity and true affection. She was no longer merely obligated by circumstance or gratitude for his past kindnesses. She was totally devoted and deeply, irrevocably in love with the man she had scorned. The parson, a man whose face was set in the usual expression of mild suffering, finally mounted the pulpit. The church fell silent. Elizabeth straightened her spine, preparing herself for the familiar, rhythmic cadence of the liturgy. Then came the necessary interruption, the public announcement that anchored their shared future to the traditions of Meryton. I publish the banns of marriage between Fitzwilliam Darcy, of Pemberley in the county of Derbyshire, and Elizabeth Bennet of Longbourn in this parish. It was the third time, the final confirmation. A wave of emotion, so strong it felt physical, washed over her. She gripped Darcy's forearm lightly. Before the accident, hope had felt extinguished. Her pride, as well as her reputation, lay ruined, and her future seemed uncertain. Yet here they were. Everything had turned to good, not through manipulation or clever planning, but through sheer terrifying necessity and the slow, humbling process of mutual understanding. Darcy covered her hand with his own, a warm, steady weight. She leaned her head closer to his shoulder, inhaling the comforting scent of wool and soap, a scent of stability. She had found strength in adversity, and in finding strength, she had found love. Her prejudice had been overcome not by philosophical argument, but by the simple, enduring reality of a man's silent suffering. She looked forward now, not with the trepidation of a woman marrying above her station, but with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew her husband, flaws and all, and who cherished him beyond measure. Chapter 16. The Meryton church was, on this particular Sunday morning, filled with its usual congregation, the respectable, the curious, and the merely habitual. Elizabeth tried to focus on the dusty shafts of sunlight slanting through the high windows and the droning hum of a fly, but her mind kept drifting to the astonishing revelations of the past weeks. The parson, a man whose sermons often felt like well-worn paths, began to read. His voice, usually a predictable cadence, took on a sudden, earnest gravity. This morning, we turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verse 13. He announced, his gaze sweeping over the pews. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Elizabeth, who had been idly tracing the pattern of her glove, stilled. The words, simple yet profound, resonated with an unexpected clarity. The parson continued, leaving the scripture to elaborate. My dear flock, consider the magnitude of this statement. God, our Heavenly Father, saw the fall of man into sin. He saw his creation, his beloved children, stumble and fall into darkness, separated from his divine light. But could he stay passive? Could he merely observe our ruin? The parson paused, allowing the question to hang in the air, heavy with implication. No, 1,000 times no. His boundless love would not permit it. Elizabeth felt a prickling sensation at the back of her eyes. Could he stay passive? The phrase struck her with the force of a physical blow. She thought of herself, of her family, poised on the precipice of utter disgrace, and the chilling inaction of so many, the smug satisfaction of others. And so, the parson's voice boomed softly, he sent the most precious part of his life, his only son. He sent Christ, not merely to observe, not merely to judge, but to save, to intervene, to redeem us from our fatal errors. The most precious part of his life, his only son. Elizabeth's mind, unbidden, conjured the image of Mr. Darcy, not his physical form, but his essence, his honor, his pride, his unimpeachable character, his social standing. These were the things that defined him, that were precious to him, perhaps more than life itself to a man of his elevated principles. And had he not, in a manner of speaking, sacrificed these? He not only was ready to save us, the parson continued, his voice rising with passion, but practically gave his life for us, dying in our place. He took upon himself our sins, our shame, our punishment. He endured the ultimate cost so that we might live, so that we might be free. Practically gave his life for us, dying in our place. The words echoed in Elizabeth's soul like a mournful bell. She saw it all now, stark and undeniable. Not only he had literally laid down a significant part of his life, his wealth, his peace of mind, his standing for her family, for her, but he'd been ready to sacrifice his life to save her from the mud of the landslide. A shudder ran through her. The tears which she had been valiantly trying to hold back now freely spilled. They traced hot paths down her cheeks, blurring the sunlight, the altar, the stern faces of the apostles painted on the ceiling. This was not a general, pious weeping. This was a profound personal grief and an overwhelming, humbling gratitude. That, the parson concluded, his voice soft now, filled with a deep reverence, my dear friends, is the greatest love story ever told. A love that does not stand by passively, but intervenes, sacrifices, and redeems. The tears could not be stopped. Elizabeth covertly fumbled for her handkerchief, pressing it to her eyes, ashamed of her public display of emotion, yet utterly incapable of stemming the tide. She understood the parallel with astounding clarity. She saw past the theological layers to the beating heart of the human experience. Mr. Darcy, whom she had so cruelly misjudged, had done no less. He had not stayed passive when her family faced ruin. He had sent the most precious part of himself, his honor, his effort, his fortune, his whole life to save them. He had practically given his life for her family, so they might be saved. It was indeed the greatest love story she had ever personally witnessed, and it was hers. The weight of his sacrifice, the depth of his unsolicited love, settled upon her, transforming her understanding of God's love and of the astonishing, redemptive power of true affection. She had been blind, so blind, but now she saw. And her heart, though still aching with regret for her past follies, swelled with a love so vast it threatened to burst. Elizabeth, seated beside Mr. Darcy, felt the weight of her bonnet pins pressing lightly against her skull. Yet the dull comfort of the familiar surroundings was offset by the unusual force of the sermon. Darcy had loved the one who was unworthy, in the eyes of society and perhaps himself, due to her disgrace. And he had loved her even when she had actively rejected the immense gift of his affection. His steadfast return to Longbourn, without blame or bitterness, and his willingness to rescue her, was the purest imitation of unconditional grace she had ever witnessed. A single, hot conviction settled in Elizabeth's heart. If I had not been loved by Darcy, I would not have understood this love. Her intense human experience, the painful, beautiful journey from hatred to devotion, had prepared the soil of her soul to comprehend something far larger than Pemberley or matrimony. Her love for Darcy was less the end of a story, and more a lens through which she could finally glimpse the greatest love story, the divine patience that loved the world despite its chronic, blinding pride. In her understanding, God's grace was like Darcy's persistent affection, a gift offered freely, waiting for the recipient to shed their prejudice and admit their own deficiency. She squeezed his hand again, harder this time, a gasp of gratitude escaping her lips that was instantly masked by a cough. Darcy shifted subtly, leaning closer to her, his brow furrowed with concern. He glanced down at their intertwined hands, his expression asking a quiet question. "Are you well?" Elizabeth met his gaze. Her eyes were bright, filled not with distress, but with a startling, intense realization. She did not speak. She could not articulate the theological epiphany that had just swept her away. How could she explain that the sermon about God had suddenly and entirely become a sermon about him? Instead, she offered him a look of such overwhelming, almost reverent tenderness that Darcy felt a sudden rush of warmth and confusion. He knew women sometimes wept during sermons, but Elizabeth was not prone to such displays. Yet the look she gave him was more eloquent than tears. It was the look of a soul who had just received a startling and beautiful revelation. Oh, he simply tightened his grip, silently promising her everything. Elizabeth smiled slowly, a beautiful, genuine smile of deep inner peace. She knew her love for Darcy would never be perfect. It was human, subject to daily irritations and worldly concerns. But she now understood that their love was a sacred testament, a practical lesson, given to her so she might achieve a higher understanding. Their story, her prejudice, his pride, their necessary humility, it had all been a painful, blessed schooling leading her straight to the heart of the greatest love story of all. And she was infinitely, profoundly grateful to the man who had been the instrument of her education.